From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ed Emmett, Baker Institute Fellow and host for this briefing. We find ourselves in an election year in both the United States and Mexico, where the U.S. Mexico border is really one of the top topics in both countries. In the United States, in fact, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump both paid a visit to the Texas Valley recently on the same day. And meanwhile, Mexico is facing its own presidential election this year on June the 2nd. And many view it as a referendum on the ruling MORENA party, including that party's policies on domestic economy, public spending, and cartel violence. So today we're talking about these issues and more. Joining me are two colleagues from the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, Tony Payan and Ivan Rodriguez. And this is a special crossover episode of Baker Briefing. It's a returning podcast from the Center for the U.S. and Mexico, the Judy Leigh Allen Mexico-centered podcast. So Tony, Ivan, thank you for joining me. So we will dive right in. Tony, let's start with Mexico's elections. They're now just 3 months away, and I suppose most listeners in the United States anyway haven't been following that closely. Can you tell us who are the major presidential candidates? What's at stake in Mexico's presidential election coming up?
Yeah, I think Mexico is going through a very difficult transition, political transition. There is a lot of disappointment with democracy, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that people confuse democracy as a method to solve policy problems. And the reality is that democracy is a method by which we distribute power, we calibrate the ability to make decisions, and we choose new people to make decisions. And I think in Mexico, people expected much more from democracy over the last 30 years. They expected their problems to be solved, and they placed this incredible burden on the democratic process. That failed. I think there was a lot of discontent, political disappointment in Mexico, and people chose a populist, Mr. López Obrador. But like any populist in Latin America, I think Mr. López Obrador is 5 months away from the end of his term. I think we can conclude that Mr. López Obrador has been a failure. His security policy has completely failed. The abrazos no balazos, or hugs not bullets, policy towards criminals, I think has failed. The country is now overrun by gangs and engaged in all kinds of mafia-style activities and people suffering from crime and violence. The economy is practically flat. Even though it grew about 3.2% in 2023, it barely caught up to its 2018 level. So we're talking about a sexennial, 6-year term that had practically no growth, no economic growth. And we also saw that the economy may actually be in recession because we're talking about an economy that's been subsidized at a tune of $65 billion in remittances from Mexican migrants abroad. That's 4.5% of the economy. So clearly, Mexicans abroad are the ones propping up a lot of the consumption. And the other really important issue is that the president has deteriorated the institutions in the country. All the autonomous institutions, regulatory institutions, co-opted Congress. So his populism, I think, has sent Mexico's clock back probably 30 years. And yet, as we see the polls today, Claudia Sheinbaum, his hand-picked successor, is ahead in the polls and likely to be elected, which means that the opposition hasn't yet presented in coalition, as they're going, behind Xochitl Gálvez, an alternative that at least 50% of the Mexicans will see as truly valuable or that can restore order and prosperity in the country. So it's a difficult election.
So we have to note the fact, though, that two leading candidates are both women.
Of course. Look, it's women's time. In Mexico, this is a big issue because over the last few decades, Mexico has passed a series of legislative initiatives pushing for women to get elected. This is not by fiat. This is not by some sort of spontaneous thing. I think in Mexico there has been a very serious effort to recruit candidates. And in fact, the law states that 50% of all the candidates of the political parties have to be women. So sometimes, for example, there's 9 governorships in play in this particular election in 2024. At least 4 or 5 of the candidates from each of the two coalitions have to be women. So some men were left out because the parties had to shove them aside to choose a woman. By law, they had to present half of the candidates to be women. Now, it so happens that once López Obrador handpicked a woman, Claudia Sheinbaum, then the opposition sought very hard to find a good candidate who is a woman that they could present, because otherwise it would actually make them weaker. And so they found a very competitive candidate, and that is Xochitl Gálvez, a senator in Mexico, and I think she's an attractive candidate. And so now we have two women. There's a third man who's a candidate, I think Álvarez Maínez from the Citizen Movement Party, but I think he's collapsing in the polls to single digits, in the low single digits. So definitely Mexico will have a woman president, partly because it's been forced by law and partly as a strategic move by the opposition to ensure that they also put up a woman to compete with López Obrador's handpicked successor.
As someone who has grown up in Texas, I think I can speak for a lot of the listeners. We have done a poor job of really understanding Mexican government and Mexican politics, and that's something that we look forward to correcting over the coming years, certainly through the Baker Institute. Let's shift to relations with the United States, also holding major elections this year. And there's been a spotlight on the border where there were a record 3.2 million migrant encounters just in the past fiscal year, according to RAND. I think most people would agree the border's in crisis mode right now, completely uncontrolled. What does U.S. Mexico cooperation look like on that issue, and why has it been so hard to resolve, Tony?
I think that the U.S. and Mexico have a very difficult partnership. It's always been like that. I think we need to study history and realize that going back to the 1800s, this has been a very difficult relationship. Ups and downs are characteristic of the binational relationship. I think in the last 30 years, since about the early 90s, with the collapse of communism and the triumph of capitalist or market-oriented economies, the relationship sort of warmed up a little bit. There was a lot of economic integration. There was a lot of hope that the two countries could collaborate on strengthening Mexico's institutions, turning Mexico into a market-based economy, and that the U.S. would have a freer hand in Mexico. And that happened for about a quarter of a century, but it's been the last 7-8 years have been quite difficult, I think, with Trump in the White House in the United States back in 2017, and López Obrador getting elected in 2018. The relationship has gotten a lot rockier. There are more nationalistic impulses behind it, and I think they're going to be present in the 2024 election. So we shouldn't expect this to go smoothly. I think Biden has made some important concessions to Mexico in terms of organized crime, in terms of kind of a less than stellar implementation of the USMCA, mostly to get Mexico's cooperation on immigration at the border. But obviously that's not the way that a relationship should function. It shouldn't be, I'm going to give you a pass on this and that so that I can get your help on that. That turns the relationship into a very difficult exchange. I think there ought to be more institutionalized, broader frameworks of cooperation on all issues, and that's what we do not have. So the next president in the United States, whoever that may be, and the next president in Mexico will just have to figure out how to build those institutions.
Yeah, but I think that immigration policy will be a key element in who is going to be the next president of the U.S. Of course, they are not going to solve the problem that we have in the border crisis. And also, both countries, as Tony said, are taking advantage of this crisis. López Obrador, with this trade-off to trying to stop or not the influx of migrants to the U.S., and Donald Trump with the argument that Biden couldn't solve the problem, and he will do it. So at the end, a lot of priorities have been in these governments, but the border crisis and immigration, of course, is out of these priorities, I think.
Before we leave the border issue, I have to ask, in years past, again, as I said, I grew up in Texas, the U.S.-Mexico border was for all intents and purposes open. People went back and forth shopping, and nobody paid that much attention to how long someone stayed on one side or the other. But in today's world, we're not just talking about Mexicans and U.S. citizens going across the border. We're talking about people from all over the world. What's your read on who's coming across the border and why and what can be done?
Yeah, I think Ivan pointed out to a really important thing, and that is both countries, I think, in the case of López Obrador and the Trump administration, manipulated the issue of immigration. In my view, they were not interested in solving it. They were rather interested in exploiting the issue politically because it's profitable. It's profitable here, and it's profitable for Mexico. It's profitable for, I think, the Republicans and Donald Trump in the United States because it's the one thing that really pays off, and we see that they've managed to sow this particular concern throughout the country, despite the fact that I think the immigration issue is fairly solvable in the United States. And it's profitable in Mexico because Mr. López Obrador has been able to corner Mr. Biden by opening the floodgates and closing the floodgates of immigrants. And that means that all these nationalities that are making it through Mexico, Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, Ecuadorians, and some people from Africa and some people from other countries in South America, and even beyond, because we are also seeing a surge in Chinese coming through Mexico, trying to make their way into the United States. In last fiscal year, 30,000 Chinese were caught trying to enter the United States. So clearly Mexico has become a passageway, a kind of a global passageway for a lot of these migrants. And so Mexico has no control of its borders. It could, potentially, because it's demonstrated when there is an agreement between Biden and López Obrador, Mexico actually slows the flow down or even stops it. But as soon as the relationship gets rocky or the U.S. government puts some pressure on Mexico, then he opens the floodgates and let the migrants go. So it's been a very profitable issue both domestically in the United States and in the bilateral relationship for Mexico. And so no one has any incentive to solve something that they can profit from politically.
Okay, let's leave the border to what I think is a much happier topic, and that is U.S. Mexico trade issues. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, Mexico is now the United States' biggest trade partner. The pandemic played into that some, but now Mexico has surpassed China as the #1 trade partner for the United States. So, Ivan, what are the most important dynamics driving that trade right now, and where do you see it going in the future?
Well, first, as you said, Mexico is now the top U.S. trading partner, surpassing not only China, but also Canada. Mexico's trade with the U.S. total around $799 billion that year, followed by Canada, and then China. Exports to the U.S., Mexico is #1, then China, and then Canada. So, and the two-way trade was boosted by exports of gasoline and other fuels, and imports of passenger vehicles, auto parts, and computer chips. So at the end, the nurturing activity seems that is helping this trading activity, well, this situation in Mexico to export more to the U.S., also the USMCA. So at the end, we are having more dynamic trade between Mexico and the U.S. because a lot of firms in other countries are trying to take advantage of the proximity with the U.S. And you can see that Mexico also depends on the exports to the U.S. Around 84% of all exports from Mexico are to the U.S. In second place is Canada, around 2.9%, and China, exports from Mexico to China, they are around 2%. So at the end, Mexico can take advantage because of the nurturing activity and the USMCA, and firms from China are moving to Mexico and other firms trying to take advantage of these dynamics in trade.
This strikes me as very frustrating because you would think that the United States would recognize the importance of Mexico as a trade partner. I mean, I chair the Texas Freight Advisory Committee for the Department of Transportation, and if you go to the bridge at Laredo, 18,000 trucks a day are coming across. How do we get beyond some of these border issues or even the long-standing historical ties between the United States and Mexico where they haven't been equal partners? I think it's fair to say that, but they're getting there. How do we make that happen in the future? Because it seems in both countries' interest for relations to go to a whole different level. I'll throw that out to either one of you.
Yeah, let me say something along the lines of what Ivan was mentioning. I know that there is a lot of hype around the fact that China may be now the U.S. third trading partner and that Mexico surged, partly because China dropped. If you look at the graphs, in the last few years, China has actually dropped down a little bit, whereas Mexico has been steadily rising. So the lines crossed, and now Mexico appears as #1. But I have some doubts about that. I think Ivan is looking at the numbers, and I think Ivan may be able to say something about that. But if you think about where China is relocating its production, it is going to Vietnam, it is going to Cambodia, it is going to Africa, it is going to Mexico. Mexico has become a really important recipient of Chinese investment. So what I think the Chinese strategy is today is to essentially go to places that have a freer access to the American market and then build there, relabel to the best of their ability, and then re-enter the United States as a Vietnamese or a Mexican product. So I think the Chinese continue to be, in my view, the number one trading partner of the United States. But it doesn't say made in China any longer. So we have to be careful with the numbers. I think we need to do some forensic work in understanding that. There's a lot of concern in Washington, D.C., I've been there, about the Chinese presence in Mexico. I think, Ed, to resolve that problem that you're mentioning, the next step, if there is enough vision, and perhaps this is the way to also gain some leverage in Mexico, is going to be a customs union, because then Canada, the United States, and Mexico will be responsible for figuring out what really is being built within North America and what qualifies. So I would shed some doubt on the numbers, highlight the concern by Washington politicians on this, and think that the Chinese are not simply going to give up on the American market. They're going to find ways to stay in the American market.
Just a simple agreement. Okay, well, knowing that we're running a little short on timing, Ivan, I'm going to throw some things at you here in rapid order. Public spending. Our understanding of what's going on in Mexico is cloudy at best. But of the 38 countries in the OECD, Mexico is last when it comes to healthcare spending. Similarly, they rank low in investment in education. And you throw on top of that the cartel violence that's going on in Mexico. What do we see coming after the election? If we assume that Sheinbaum wins the election, what do you see happening to address the spending in healthcare, the spending in education, and curtailing cartel violence?
Well, first, the government of Mexico plans to have public spending of around 26% of its GDP. It seems a lot, but the majority of these resources is already allocated for different issues like social programs, infrastructure projects, transfers from the federal government to the state. So at the end, you have really you have enough resources for the health and education sectors, for example. So we are talking about around 2.8% of public spending going to health, for example. And the problem in Mexico is that this is not what organizations as the World Health Organization recommends, that it's around 6%. So it's pretty below. And you have that in recent years, the federal government has taken some of those resources to other non-health programs. So at the end, you will have less than 2.8%. And in education, you have the same problem. You have that it's going to be around 3% of GDP. So at the end, a lot of Mexicans are out of the public services in health and education. Talking about health, the number is around 50 million Mexicans. And what's going to happen is that these people need the government to get money. So at the end, the majority of these people will vote for Morena because they think that López Obrador and Morena are giving them the money. So at the end, we have a lot of pressure on these people to vote for Morena.
So, Tony, Ivan, any closing thoughts? And the one thing we didn't touch on, is there any hope for curtailing the cartels?
Not in the current strategy. Abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets, cannot be the strategy. And I think the Republicans are not making it easier by arguing that the U.S. should act unilaterally against the cartels. I suppose that through undercover operations and things like that, that's not going to work. It has to be a collaborative framework. It has to be a binational framework. And I think this is a problem from hell in Mexico. The López Obrador administration has allowed organized crime to grow to horrendous levels, victimizing just about 100% of the population, costing quite a bit of the GDP in security. And I don't mean the government's spending, I mean the individual spending, because you have to spend on ensuring that your vehicle is bulletproof, I guess, ensuring that you have the right kind of protection for your homes and your property. Of course, this is also creating an exodus of brilliant, smart Mexicans who are taking themselves and their money into Texas. You see the huge boom of Mexican middle class and upper class migration to Texas and California and Arizona and Florida and New York and on and on. So this problem is costing Mexico quite a bit. We haven't done the accounting just yet on how much that costs. It's often difficult to estimate. But I think if the country doesn't do it, then the only solution for the United States is going to be to close the border. And we just heard Donald Trump, the candidate, say that he will impose 10% tariffs on trade, damaging obviously the relationship, damaging even some U.S. companies. And he's done it before. He threatened 25% tariffs if Mexico didn't stop immigration. I think if he were to win the election, he's probably going to do the same thing and say, I will impose tariffs if you don't get a hold of this problem. But then you enter into a game of pressure, brinksmanship, and of course, zero-sum game that is not useful to either country.
And this will affect, of course, Americans because they are going to pay more for the products here in the U.S. So that's a big issue.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for participating. For more on what's ahead for Mexico in 2024, I invite listeners to go to bakerinstitute.org/MCO, where you can read this year's Mexico Country Outlook. That's an annual report by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico. I also encourage listeners to tune in to our returning Judy Leigh Allen Mexico-centered podcast, which explores immigration, trade, sustainability, and more, available wherever you listen to podcasts. I think I would be remiss if I didn't point out Baker Institute's located in Texas. We're adjacent to Mexico. It's obvious how important the U.S.-Mexico relationship is, and we all need to have a much better understanding of what goes on south of the border. Baker Briefing is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Karina Zimmel. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Our interns are Rice University students Riley Barker, Gray Bobian, and Maria Morcus. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.